This is a review of Chapter 4. So, why is the criminal justice system failing? The authors believe that we really have a distorted picture of who to arrest. And the Pyrrhic defeat theory that has been discussed throughout the book really, once again, we failed to implement policies that can reduce crime and harm. We fail to treat harmful acts that are done by rich and powerful organizations and people. And we fail to eliminate the economic bias within the criminal justice system that really tips the surveillance of the poor. So historically, this has occurred where the poor are seen as a threat, and to the point that some people would say they're morally defective because they commit crimes. We failed to remember that most of the victims of street crime are poor themselves, and they have no power to change this, nor can they get people who have power to change it. And so ultimately, the authors say that the criminal justice system really shapes the public's conception on what's dangerous. And so we're always looking down. So one of the things, too, why wouldn't you change the system? Well, more and more, the free market has really infiltrated the criminal justice system to make money. And we've seen privatization really push corporate interests. So an example is private prisons. They're for-profit organizations with shareholders, and they lobby to keep tough sentences on drug offenders and keep issues up on immigration so they can fill their facilities. Closer example is the privatization of food, which Michigan did. And before 2013, the food was served in all the state prisons by MDOC employees who were called food service leaders, and they supervised the inmates. And so, because they were employees, then they were very concerned about the care, custody, and control of the inmates. But it came about that the leadership decided that this was a good idea to save money, get rid of some union workers, and then privatize the food through a corporation. And so they started with Aramark, which they had so many problems with, inferior food. And one of the things from a prison, you want to have good food to make the inmates happy so they don't fight. But they also had problems with workers. Some had felonies. They caught workers having sex with the inmates, bringing drugs into the inmates. They would serve subpar food or food that had been contaminated by rodents. It was a mess. So finally, they fired the Aramark Corporation and they hired Trinity. But in reality, Trinity was costing more overall than it was to have the union workers that originally supervised the food. And they still had problems with inferior quality of food and services and almost a gang takeover of threatening the workers. So in February of this year, the state ultimately moved to end the privatization of food. So it's almost kind of a cycle. There are some things that shouldn't be privatized and shouldn't be open to the free market for money. Some other things outside of the criminal justice system that makes money, if you create a fear that crime could be happening to you next, many people have bought guns. And so gun sales increase because of this fear. So that's good for the gun owners or the gun companies. Equipment makers, stun guns, Kevlar vests, pepper spray, body cams. Now, more and more we see technology being used to surveil people. Along the privatization, that jails and prisons also privatize medical services, where 40 years ago there was nurses on staff. And even to the point of private security forces. I just read an article where California neighborhoods hired their own private police forces to keep their neighborhood safe because the sheriff's department had such budget constraints, they didn't have enough officers to protect the whole area. So ultimately, people are making money on the criminal justice system, and so why would you want to change it? So the criminal justice system concentrates on this individual wrongdoing, and it appears to be politically neutral. But in reality, politics is the one, and the politicians are the ones that make the laws. So they focus on individual situations and they really ignore the conditions. So if you haven't watched the video on Mesner and Rosenfeld, one of the things that they say is that our society pushes the value of individualism so much that if somebody fails, we just blame them. So you can blame the poor for being poor, they must just be lazy. So ultimately, our laws reflect this implicit judgment that individuals are responsible for their own lives, and the social conditions don't really have an effect, or that we're responsible for them. So the second thing is that the criminal law is really politically neutral, and it is the boundaries of what is considered decent social life. And so many of the laws are in place to protect those that have more money than the poor. So, like theft laws is about what an individual already owns. It never looks at the distribution of property. The structural causes of crime are overlooked because we're too busy blaming the individual or going after the individual. So again, watch the PowerPoint on Mesner and Rosenfeld. Ultimately, this leads to the bonus of bias. So the more we point down to the lower classes, the more we fear them, which then takes our eyes off any predatory acts of the rich. An example is that this becomes an ideology that becomes ingrained. So I give an example here, politicians, which one does the public favor? If you're afraid of crime coming to your neighborhood, someone who runs on the prosecution of corporate crime, regulations that benefit society, or tax reform that doesn't favor the rich, it really doesn't have the same message as someone that runs on tougher criminal justice, tax cuts because everybody wants more money, and then the deregulation of business, because most people don't see a direct result of that deregulation of business personally until it's too late. So the authors are arguing that this then results in kind of a hostility towards the poor and little sympathy towards the poor. And so then you can erase the research that says that poverty is a cause of crime. You just don't believe it. You believe that they're just bad, evil individuals. And so therefore you can be harsher on them with more sentences, the death penalty, and then really ignoring the social conditions of violence within the neighborhoods, rampant drug use, and illegal weapons. You just kind of push it off. Well, that's their fault. That's the way they want to live. So if this ideology becomes ingrained enough, then you can fool people into believing that this is the true reality. And so economic power ultimately leads to this distortion, and it becomes a social norm. So through two ways, politicians, first of all, most of them are lawyers. It's surprising how many politicians are lawyers, but most of them come from the corporate world. So they learn how to defend business, and they keep their business ties. And so then they promote those business interests that they have already defended. And this political influence then is used in criminal justice because you're not worried about the individual or the corporation that's doing something wrong. You take the eyes off that or the focus off that, and you look to the individual or straight crime, and that's who's investigated, and that's where your resources go. So the book uses an example, even extending that, we're allowed to peacefully protest, but after a few days, then government seems to think that that's a threat, and then they use force and they break up strikes and remove people that are demonstrating. So it just shows that when you confront some of the issues and social conditions that goes on, those with the economic power don't want to really see that. So the media then helps maintain this distorted reality through supporting the existing order. So it doesn't matter which station you watch, whether it be a very liberal one or a very conservative one. Neither one really is challenging the existing social arrangements, which ultimately lead to crime and disorder. So ultimately, when we look at society, the research shows that poverty is directly linked to the predictors of deviancy. One possibility is that when you're exposed to deviance at a young age, it becomes normalized. If everybody in your neighborhood is using drugs, to a child who is young and impressionable, that just seems like that's what you do. But the research also shows that those that use substances, whether it be cigarettes or alcohol or drugs at a younger age, change the brain pathways and ultimately lead to more susceptibility to lifelong addiction. So it's something to think about. And we'll explore this further in this chapter.